I've been a ranger at High Hollow National Park for 15 years, which means I've driven every fire road, hiked every switchback, and learned the way a spruce smells before rain. I signed on when the radio still hissed worse than it spoke, and the maps we used were hand-marked with pencil and sweat. My station sits on a ridge that gets lightning twice every July and frost twice every September, and at night the timberline stands like an audience that refuses to applaud. Before they gave me a truck and a call sign and a ring of keys, the old chief gave me one rule that sounded like superstition and tasted like iron. If you hear your name spoken after dark, do not answer. On paper, my job was simple. Check trailheads, count cars and campsites, patch fences and shut gates, escort lost day hikers back to a gravel lot full of raccoon prints and rental SUVs. Pick up the beer cans in the picnic area before a photo from the overlook shows the can and not the valley. Every shift began at the same crooked desk where the coffee maker had burned in a ring, and a laminated card under the phone listed the usual numbers: fire, sheriff, maintenance, wildlife. The radio sat in its cradle, heavy as a brick, and the first thing I'd do was flip it to our local channel and say my call sign out of habit, as if the mountains needed me to declare that I was here. The park is big enough that you can get lost, not just temporarily turn around, but evaporated from the idea that paved roads exist. We have subalpine meadows that shimmer in late June and talus slopes where pikas squeak like toys that are running out of air. We have a stretch of old growth that survived logging by accident and law, and in that stretch the light falls like spilled honey and the silence hums so hard it becomes a sound. 2 families of spotted owls live out there, and we pretend we can protect them, as if anything we do matters at the scale of 1,000 storms. The tourists flow like a migrating herd, and we try to steer and count them without spooking them. They ask the same questions, because the same questions are what you ask when the world becomes this big. How long is the loop? Where can we see wildlife? Are there bears? Are there mountain lions? The answer is yes to everything alive, but I've learned to say it in a way that sounds like reassurance and not warning. We post signs that say carry water and start early and flash flood zone. And then we wait for the afternoon thunderhead like a schoolteacher waits for the bell. I learned the park the way you learn a face you love. The first winter, I learned the way the wind recites the names of the ridges in the dark. By the second, I knew the smell of a dead elk 3 draws over and the metallic breath of a generator about to quit. By the 5th, I could tell when a storm was coming by the static in my fillings and the way ravens got curious and silent at the same time. And every year I trusted that the map matched the ground, because that's what maps are for. They tell you that if you put your boot here, you end up there. Lately, though, that confidence has been a thing I carry like a fragile cup. Trails subtle as threads have looked wrong under familiar trees. Distances have stretched like taffy. I've found cairns where no one should build cairns and scars on bark that look like letters made by someone who learned to write from watching people through glass. The woods felt like a house where someone had moved the furniture half an inch, just enough for you to stub your toe in the dark. It didn't help that we'd had fires 2 years ago. The scars still ran like dull coins across the ridges, and even the green that came back felt too green, like an apology. Fire opens the forest, and light comes in where it didn't before, and animals change their routes, and people follow the animals. And so maybe that's what I told myself when I noticed the way the elk trails braided together into a pattern that made my scalp itch. I erased pins and added others on the wall map and said the word recovery like an excuse. We only had 3 of us on the rotation most weeks, and 2 of them were new. Kira had a rescue dog's energy and a habit of humming as she checked her gear. Saul was a former ski patroller who treated radio silence like a dare. It made me feel old to be the one telling them where the old mine shafts were and the names of the families who still cut Christmas trees on the edges of the park. It made me feel older when I realized I'd never told anyone about the rule I'd been given, the one that never felt like it belonged in a ranger manual. I thought about the rule on a Monday when the sky had the glossy look of a creek stone and the forecast called for heat, then a squall, then heat again. Mondays always start slow and end with something broken. I ran my loop early, checking the trailhead parking and the bare lockers, and my radio worked with the landline's echo as dispatch told me there was a call. A hiker from the North Ridge called in to say she'd found a boot on the trail. Not a pair, not even a fresh one, just a single boot, toe pointed uphill, no laces. People lose shoes. People do all kinds of things. I took a breath and said I'd take a look. Up past mile marker 9, the switchback's narrow and the trail leans over a drop that will turn you into a story if you take 3 wrong steps in a row. I found a boot exactly where the caller said it would be. It was black, scuffed, and stiff with sun and old mud. The laces were missing, but that happens. Somebody breaks a lace and keeps hiking, and later the boot gets bounced off a pack or kicked over his side, and the animals knows it, and there you go. Still, I picked it up and felt the weight of it like a river stone. It was heavier than it looked. I turned it over and saw something I didn't like. On the sole, the rocks lodged into the tread weren't rocks. They were seeds, or rather, they were the papery husks you get when a certain kind of seed splits and sends a sprout into soil. Except there was no soil in the tread, and the paper had pressed itself into the rubber as if the boot had walked over a field of unwrapped moths. I pried one free with my multi-tool, and it came away with a damp sound. It smelled like the first minute after you open a root cellar. I rationalized everything I could. Maybe the boot had been left by a trail crew who walked through a burn zone where burrs grew heavy. Maybe some prankster had glued seed husks into the sole. Maybe moisture and heat do weird things to old rubber. And maybe if you leave a boot in the woods long enough, it begins to compost into the idea of a boot. I put in an evidence bag, because that's the kind of sentence you say when your job includes the word ranger, and I hiked back down with the thing like a lucky charm I didn't want. Back at the station, I scanned the missing person binder. I hate that binder. It's a history of people who thought the land would forgive them. We keep it so we know who to keep an eye out for when bones surface or a pack turns up at the base of a cliff like a shed skin. None of the photos showed a boot like the one I had. I logged it, labeled it, and set on the shelf under the radio, and the building felt like it grew an inch taller to avoid it. The first storm rolled in at 3. Lightning came 1, 2, 3, and then thunder pushed its shoulder against the walls. The radio hissed and burped with atmospheric noise until I turned it down. Rain walked across the lot in diagonal lines and turned the dust to a slick that reflected the sky. Somewhere out on the ridge, a tree cracked, and I felt it in my teeth. Storms clean things. They wrench tracks and break branches that were going to fall anyway. I sat and watched the rain and told myself that tomorrow I'd take a new crew member on a ridge patrol and show them the places where storms teach you humility. When a storm left, it took the heat with it, but it left a strange smell behind. Not pine, not wet dirt, not ozone. It was like old paper. When Saul swung by after his loop, he said he smelled it too. We stood under the eaves and pointed our noses like dogs. The rain fell in last-minute drops from the gutter, and a coyote trotted across the empty lot with the confidence of a tax collector. We didn't say the word weird, because the second you say it, you're admitting you're not in charge. That night, I drove home to my little rental in the employee housing strip. The houses line up like Monopoly pieces under the cottonwoods, and the porch lights are all the same cheap lantern style you can buy 5 for $100. I made pasta in a pot with a dent in it and ate standing up because some days you don't deserve a chair. The wind combed the trees. Somewhere a screen door banged and then remembered how to latch. I showered, and the water ran cold for a minute that lasted a mile. When I lay down, I felt the day settle into the muscles of my back like coins in a jar. At 2 in the morning, the wind woke me with a sound like footsteps on the porch. I lay still, counting the spaces between gusts. You learn out here not to leap up every time a raccoon decides to audition for Hamlet on your steps. The footsteps went from the boards to the gravel, and then to the dirt, and then I heard my name. It was not loud. It was not a shout. It was 6 letters spoken the way you say a word into a fan and listen to it come back wobbled. I did not move. My throat closed up on my breath, and that rule, the one that once felt like a superstition, came back whole and hard. If you hear your name spoken after dark, do not answer. The syllables of it were a path out of the room. The pressure in the air had changed with the storm, and my ears popped like I'd driven over the pass without cracking the window. I waited and counted my heartbeats and heard my name again, a little closer like it had learned how to walk. I'd like to say I'm made of iron. I'm not. I like to say I sprang to the window and swung a light into the yard and saw a raccoon or a prankster or a kid with a dare and a phone. I didn't. I lay rigid while a third time came, softer, with the second syllable stretched, as if it wanted to find where my attention lived. Then the wind carried the sound off like a waitress who never returns with the check. I waited until a long time had put skin over the moment. Then I turned my head, inch by careful inch, to look at the window. Nothing stood there but my own dumb reflection and a moth that had mistaken the glass for a moon. In the morning, I made coffee too strong and drank it anyway. The sunlight had that brand new smell that comes after a storm has polished the world. I told myself the wind had said my name. The wind has imagination. It has spoken to me before through cracks and rocks and branches and the shape of the valley. I told myself that, and then I went to work and checked the boot on the shelf like a talisman, and that smell of old paper and damp cellars crept out of the bag even though I'd sealed it hard. The first incident you can deny. The second gets under your fingernails. This one started with a call from a volunteer who runs the North Lookout on weekends for the birders. She said a trail sign had been vandalized. People carve things into signs, initials, hearts, arrows. We sand, we repaint, we sigh, and the cycle goes around. I drove out with a kit and told myself I'd maybe stop at the lower meadow and listen for the owls if there was time. The sign stood where it's always stood, at the fork where the ridge trail splits into the loop or the long way to the lake. It's a simple cedar board with routed letters that tell you distances. Left, lake 4.2 miles. Right, rim 2.3 miles. A smaller sign below warns about lightning and the lack of water. Now, someone had added another line in the same neat, routed style, which was what made me frown. The letters had the same depth, the same clean edges, the same unfaded color. The line said, in a tidy, authoritative font, "Stay quiet after dusk." I crouched, and the wood smelled of cut cedar and rain. You don't route a sign on site. You don't match paint and edges without a shop. I checked the back for the metal tag we staple into official signs. The tag stared up at me, stamped with our inventory number. I touched the new letters and felt a raised burr, fine as hair, where the carving had lifted the grain. Wet dust still lay in the shadowed parts, like the sign had been made here last night, while the storm raged on and lightning counted itself off beyond the ridge. A hiker came down the path as I crouched. Middle-aged, trail poles, new boots, the kind of efficient backpack that says he watched a dozen videos before buying. He tipped his hat and asked if the lake was worth it. I said yes like I always do, and then added that weather can sock in without warning and to turn around if he started to feel the hair on his arms lift. He nodded as if I'd told him a riddle whose answer was obvious. When he'd gone, I scraped at the surface of the new letters with my knife. The cedar, dust came up the color of tea. The edges of the letters were moist, somehow, under the paint. I looked around the trees, and for a moment, just a moment, the trail's left fork looked wrong. The shadows under the firs were too heavy, as if someone had piled up night in little drifts. Then a cloud moved, or my head did, and the shade reconnected in a normal shade, and I told myself I needed to eat something before blood sugar made me superstitious. I reported the sign to maintenance. They told me not to worry about it. They hadn't made any new signs, but maybe an old one had been swapped from storage by a well-meaning volunteer. I knew that wasn't true because I knew the inventory number. I said I'd bring it in. They said fine, and to flag the post so people wouldn't miss the junction. I unscrewed the sign and slid it into the truck. It was heavier than it should have been. When I set it on the back seat, I caught the scent I hated, paper, damp, cool like breath into a jar. On the way back, I stopped at the lower meadow. I turned off the engine and let the quiet rise like a tide. Insects stitched the air. A hawk made a sound that's only in movies, even though I heard it with my own ears. The grass moved as if an animal had just passed and refused to admit it. I got out and walked a dozen paces, then another dozen, until the truck behind me felt small. I put my hands on my hips like I always do when I try to look like I know what I'm doing, and I listened. The meadow has a line where the old growth begins again, and the first spruce there is tall enough to be its own idea. As I stood, something tapped my shoulder. Not hard, just the way a friend might touch you to make you turn. Except there was no one behind me, and the tall grass lay flat where I'd walked, and then lay upright where I hadn't. I did not spook easily. The wind was light and in my face. The tap had come from behind, and it had felt like a person's finger and not a seed head. I told myself it was a seed head anyway. I turned around, slow and calm, and looked out over the grass. The heads nodded at me in agreement. Back at the station, I set the sign against the wall under the window and tried to forget it was there. Paper smell, cellar smell. Kira came in from her loop with cheeks the color of cherries and a handful of trash she'd plucked from the picnic area. A tangle of fish line, a soda bottle, a foil packet that would outlive us all. She asked if I'd seen the new warning on the North Ridge sign. I told her it was a prank. She shook her head. "It's a good warning," she said. Her eyes slid to the window, where daylight had taken on that late afternoon caramel. I mean, people get weird after sunset. I didn't tell her about the knock on my name at 2 a.m. I didn't tell her about the boot that had sprouted the memory of seeds. We don't share that kind of thing because we're too busy managing the normal dangers, the ones with bones and teeth. We logged the day, we checked the weather. More storms marching in a line, like a parade that had lost its music, and we made a plan to patrol the south side after the squall passed. She left, and I sat with the boot and the sign like a person sitting with two riddles he didn't ask for. The radio cracked and made a sound like something leaning against the door. Static yawed and folded. Then a voice I didn't recognize said a unit number I didn't recognize and spoke a line in a tone that was halfway between a cough and a prayer. "If you hear your name spoken after dark, do not answer." The words came out twisted by distance, like they were traveling down a hallway that had been bent into a ring. I snatched the radio and thumbed transmit. I said my call sign and asked the unit to identify. Wind answered me, and a rustle like paper. I should have logged all of this and called the district office and asked for more bodies and more eyes. I should have called the sheriff and asked if any calls had come in from the edges of the park about prowlers or pranksters or someone with a wood shop and too much time. Instead, I did what you always do when the world begins to tilt. I tightened up my routine until it gleamed. I checked gates. I double-checked the backcountry permits and their return times. I called the weather line every hour like a nervous habit. By sundown, the second storm had rolled its shoulders up against the ridge. The front wall looked like someone had dragged a slate across the sky. Lightning wrote quick thoughts no one could read, and the air got that carbonated feel it gets before hail. I sat in the truck outside the ranger station and watched the ground darken. My truck's engine ticked as it cooled. The sign in the back seat made the air smell like a library that hadn't seen a person in 100 years. I told myself I would do one more loop before the hail. I told myself I'd drive down to the campground and make sure the folks in Site 14 had put out their fire, because they hadn't, not once, not all week. The road between the station and the campground threads through a stand of younger fir, the kind planted after a burn 30 years ago. They stand too close together, and the light between them is always the same, whether noon or dusk. As I drove, the first drops of hail snapped against the windshield like thrown rice. Half a mile shy of the campground, my headlights found a figure in the road. I braked, the ABS shivering in the pedal. The figure froze, then turned with the slow care of someone asked to move by a voice they don't trust. A man, mid-20s, wet hair slapped across his forehead. No hat, no pack. His jacket was unzipped and hung wide, and beneath it his shirt had been sliced into tidy strips, as if he'd walked too close to a machine that remembered him. He squinted into my lights and raised a hand the way a man raises a hand to a storm. I put the truck in park and reached for the radio. "Contact," I said, and gave my mile marker. "Hale, peck the hood." The man's lips moved. I rolled the window down 2 inches. "You okay?" I asked. "Left," he said. His voice sounded hoarse, like he hadn't used it in days. It said left. He blinked. His eyelashes were white with tiny beads of ice. "But right is shorter." "Who said left?" I asked. The radio hissed in my hand, as if it wanted to answer for him. "The sign," he said. He shivered, a whole body shake like a dog that has just come out of a pond. "It's new," he added, with a kind of wonder, like a child telling you about a dream. "It's helpful." I opened the door. The hail stung my bare wrist. I took the mylar blanket from behind the seat and stepped out. The storm made itself at home in my ears. "Let's get you in the truck," I said. "We'll figure it out." He stepped forward, and in the headlights wash I saw that the edges of the cuts in his shirt weren't torn. They were clean, like cuts made by a sharp tool. The skin beneath had the shallow, raised lines a person gets from brush, but it also had something else. Fine, pale dust, as if he'd crawled through the rafters of a dusty attic. He smelled like paper and damp. He smelled like the sign and the boot. In the truck, with the heater on and the blanket tied around him, he looked at my face too long, like he was waiting for me to become someone else. "What's your name?" I asked gently, because names matter, and because the rule I had been given like a coin, made the word name feel heavier than usual. He told me a first name I'll keep to myself. Then he said, "I came up from the valley. I don't usually hike after, afternoon, but I wanted to see the rim before the storm. I thought I heard someone call me. It sounded like it was back at the junction, so I went back, but no one was there." Then the hail started. His teeth clicked twice, a metronome. "I shouldn't have said anything," he added, like it just then occurred to him that he'd broken some rule. I handed him water and made a call to dispatch to say I had a cold, mildly hypothermic hiker and was bringing him to the station to warm up and sign the incident report. I didn't mention the smell. I didn't mention the sign's message said aloud by the radio in a voice that didn't belong to any of my colleagues. You learn early that what you don't put in a report can't be used to ask you questions you don't want to answer. On the drive back, the hail softened to heavy rain, and the wipers found a rhythm that made a tune if you let it. The man dozed and then jerked awake with a sound like a book closing. "It knows my name," he said, not to me, but to the space in front of him. "We'll get you warmed up," I said. "You're safe now." He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Don't say that." Back at the station, I got him wrapped in a dry blanket and put him by the space heater we use when the main unit sulks. The boot and the sign sat where I'd left them, the sign's letters absorbing light like mouths. I made tea because that's something you can do with your hands when your brain is trying to climb out a window. He held the mug like it could float him. "What did you hear?" I asked, when color had returned to his face. He stared at the rim of the mug. "My name," he said, but wrong, like it was being said by someone who had only seen it written down, like it had angles where it should have curves. He looked up at me suddenly. "Don't you get that sometimes? Hearing your name when there's no one there." He said it like he already knew the answer. I wanted to say no. I wanted to give him the comfort of a lie. Instead, I told him the truth that mattered. "There's a rule out here," I said. "You can call it superstition if you want. If you hear your name spoken after dark, do not answer." I felt the weight of the words leaving my mouth, like rocks rolled into a stream to build a crossing. He breathed out and nodded, as if I had confirmed a test answer he'd already circled. "I didn't," he said, and then, after a small pause, the first time, I waited. Rain drummed on the roof. The space heater clicked as it cycled. The second time, he said, "I did." We sat with that a while. The radio on the desk cleared its throat with a puff of static and then settled down. Outside, The rain loosened its grip, and the night pressed its face against the windows like a curious animal. I could feel the park around us, the millions of needles and leaves and stones, the paths that knit through them like veins. I thought about the sign's instruction to stay quiet after dusk and about the unmatched neatness of its letters. I thought about how language carved into wood can survive longer than a person, and how rules cross from hand to hand until no one remembers the palm that first wrote them. When he left, just before dawn, I drove him to the trailhead so he could get his rental and his warmth and his decision to never come back. He thanked me 3 times in 3 different tones that all meant help. As his taillights went down the road, the wind shifted and a smell moved through the lot. Not cedar, not rain, a rustling without sound, the memory of pages being turned in a room you can't find. I went back inside and stood over the sign and the boot like a priest over relics. Day by day, the woods kept changing in little ways. A boulder I'd used as a landmark on Mule Ridge had slid 3 feet without leaving a scrape in the moss. The creek of dry wash hummed with a tone you feel more than hear, like the hum the power lines make on cold days, except there are no power lines within 6 miles. Kira radioed me from the west slope and said she found a ring of cairns around a stump where no stump had been yesterday. She kicked one over and sand fell out, the kind of sand you only see by the lake, which was 9 miles and 600 feet of elevation away. On a Thursday, I hiked out to check the owl grove. The understory, there's a fantasy of ferns and duff and wood sorrel, a place where sound wears slippers. The air was a degree colder than the rest of the forest, the way a church is colder than a street. I stood at the edge of the grove and listened for the soft gossip of owls. Instead, I heard a different sound, regular and polite, a clack, 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 the way you hear in an old workshop when someone is testing the teeth of a hand plane. I stepped inside, and the sound stopped. When I stepped back out, it began again, as if someone were closing a drawer each time I withdrew. I do not believe a lot of things, but I believe in patterns. Patterns are just stories time tells about itself. The pattern I had was this: a boot with seeds in its sole, a sign that had written itself, a voice saying my name with the wrong mouth, and a man whose shirt had been cut into ribbons without tearing. Now a grove making a workshop's sound with no workshop. The park was rearranging, not randomly, with intention, and with the kind of boring patience that moves mountains. I began to mark small X's on my paper map in pencil where something fell off. I did it lightly, the way you write down a dream when you wake up, ashamed to see how silly it looks in daylight. The X's multiplied around the north ridge and the lower meadow, then crept toward the rim trail like a rash. I could have brought this to the district office, but there is no form for X's and smells. There's also no form for a rule first told to you in a tone you understood only later. So I kept my own records. I told myself I'd know when it was time to bring others in. I told myself that until I believed it. Nights learned new tricks. When wind moved through the cottonwoods by my house, it made the sound of pages turning, but only every third gust. When I brushed my teeth with the radio on low, I heard once the sound of someone taking a breath as if to speak my name, and I turned the radio off mid-inhale and brushed until my gums bled. On my 3rd night after the storm, I woke to the feeling of someone standing at the foot of my bed. I didn't move. The feeling went on for long minutes, a weight and a coolness, like air around a rock pulled from a river. When it left the smell behind. By then, I had broken my own habit and told Kira the rule. I told her like I was offering her a spare flashlight. If you hear your name spoken after dark, do not answer. She laughed, not because she didn't believe me, but because laughter is a way of carrying fear without dropping it. 2 days later, she called me from the West Loop with something in her voice that canceled jokes. There's a new blaze on the old red fir, she said. But it's not a blaze. It's writing. It says, she stopped. The radio hissed. Never mind what it says. She finished, her voice going careful. I'll meet you at the junction. The escalation came like weather does. Clear, then clouds, then the storm there as if it had always been. On a Saturday morning, A family came into the station with a boy who didn't speak, and they pushed him forward like an offering of explanation. He held out his hands. In his palms lay 3 little wooden triangles, perfect and exact, like someone had cut them with a laser. They smelled like cedar and varnish. I asked where he'd found them. The mother said, quietly, that they'd been in his pockets when he woke up. He had slept all night in the tent between his parents. He's a collector, she added quickly, as if anticipating trouble, but not in his sleep. I had seen triangles like that only once, in a small shop where a friend made frames for the park's educational displays. They're used as shims and wedges. They're also the exact shape of the little triangular rising points carved into the tops of our trail signs to shed water. I looked at the boy, who stared at me like an animal that has decided you are neither danger nor food. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it as if a hand had closed it for him. Later, after I'd sent them on with a smile that felt stapled to my face, I took one of the triangles to the back room and slid it against the edge of the routed letters on the Stay Quiet sign. It fit into the groove, as if the groove had been made with this wedge pressed through the wet flesh of the wood. When I drew it back, a damp powder clung to it. My throat tightened. When I washed the wedge under the sink, the smell rose up again, paper and damp, and I gagged like I'd swallowed a page. The next strange event came as a gift or a dare. I was up at the rim, overlook clearing a down limb, when the fog moved in like a cat and curled around my boots. I backed away from the edge and stood with my hand on the guardrail. The fog was thick enough that the world became a room with no walls, only a floor under your feet that might step away. The overlook has a bench made from a slab of cedar. We sand and oil it every spring. In the fog, I heard a scratching sound. Not animal scratching, writing scratching. The sound a pencil makes on wood. The bench was 6 feet away. There was no one on it. The sound went on, steady, as patient as a teacher filling a blackboard. I stepped closer. The air tasted like rain that has decided not to fall. The sound stopped. On the bench, in the sheen of last spring's oil, letters had been carved fresh and shallow with something very sharp. Careful with names, they said. The letters were clean and neat, with no raggedness, the way machine-routed letters are clean. I looked around at the fog and felt watched by something that couldn't see me, the way a book watches you while closed. I rubbed my thumb across the words, and oil rose around the letters like a bruise. I didn't know whether to be grateful or angry that the warning and the rule were spreading like a posted speed limit. Part of me was relieved that the rules existed in the world and not only in my head. Part of me understood that words which write themselves don't do it to be kind. The last calm day before things broke worse, I took the long loop with a pack heavy with small comforts. A thermos, a spare flashlight, an extra map, a knife I'd sharpened to a point that made me respect and distrust it. The light slanted the way it does only in September, even though the calendar insisted we had weeks left of August. Birdsong had a clipped, careful sound, like conversation between neighbors who share a fence they don't like. The trail underfoot felt firmer than usual, as if something had rolled a pin over it to smooth it down. At the old red fir, I stopped. Kira had said there was writing, and there was not instructions, not a rule, a line of hash marks in groups of 5, running up the bark as high as I could reach, and then beyond. There were too even to be claws, too straight to be knives gouged at random. They had a rhythm that made my stomach drop. 5, 5, 5, pause, 5. Counting. The bark dust lay at the base of the tree in a neat skirt. I stared until the line swam. A flicker scolded me, and the sound came out wrong, like a squeak in a loft. I backed away. I don't scare good, but I back away when the count is for me. By the time I reached the junction, the trail felt longer than the map said. Distances had begun to lie, and I had caught them. The air grew cooler the way a hallway grows cooler as you walk toward a door that leads down. When I reached the fork, I stopped dead. There were 2 signs now. The post that had been bare since I'd removed the cedar board now held a twin, identical to the one I had in the station. Left, lake 4.2 miles. Right, rim 2.3 miles. And below, in that same precise hand, stay quiet after dusk. The fresh paint winked at me under the dim canopy like a joke with teeth. Someone had made this and set it here where I would find it. Or something had. I approached, slow, as if the sign could startle. I touched it. It was damp, but not from rain. The damp had the feel of breath. And when I leaned close, I heard, not a sound with my ears, but the memory of a sound, the way you hear your name call from another room and then realize the house is empty. A twig snapped behind me, and because I'm not a fool, I turned. Between two firs, in the shade that was shade, a darker shape stood. It did not move. It did not breathe. It was the shape of a person in the way a scarecrow is the shape of a person, except there was nothing there to hang the shape on. I lifted my hand. The shape blurred, as if distance had shifted like a curtain in a draft. The wind came up then, and the sign creaked, and the rule spoke in my head in a voice that belonged to the old chief, and to me, and to the bench, and to the radio, and to the boot, and to the boys' triangles. If you hear your name spoken after dark, do not answer. I kept my name behind my teeth. I stood with my back to the sign and my face to the trees and waited, and the drag of the world moved over me like a slow net. I will tell you this much, because this is where the route narrows and the light slants and the ground goes from ground to guesswork. The woods are different now. The map and the land are neighbors who nod but don't speak. The distances are suggestions. The signs are writing themselves. And something that knows how to use letters but not mouths has begun to learn our names. I survived because I remember a rule that isn't on any official list, and because I kept my jaw clamped shut when the night pressed a shape against the glass and set me wrong. I survived because I learned to move like a man walking through a library where the books wake if you say the titles out loud. And if you're hearing this because you like stories or because you think the world is made of explanations, here's mine, the only one I can give without telling you the parts that the park still owns. There are places where the woods practice being something else when we're not looking. There are rules not posted on the trailhead boards because the font would be wrong. If you take nothing else from what I've just said, take the part that matters and weave it into your life the way a path weaves through bracken. After the sun drops and the trees lean close and the air smells like old paper and wet cedar, if you hear your name come from the dark, do not answer. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch with my boots on and the radio off because silence felt like the only wall I could trust. The house ticked in the way old wood does when the night leans on it. Every few minutes, a breeze moved the cottonwoods and the soft, papery rustle passed over the roof like someone turning a page above me. At first light, I made coffee that tasted like a mistake and burned my tongue on purpose. My hands weren't steady, but they worked. I took the old paper map from the hook and spread it on the table. The pencil X's I'd drawn looked like freckles on a sick thing. I added 2 more where the bench had spoken and where the second sign had stood like a mirror. Then I folded the map in half. I told myself I was going to do something simple. I would make a clean loop, check the west meadow, the red fir, and the rim overlook. I would pull the second sign and bring it in, because letting it stand felt like letting a door stay propped open. I would keep my radio on receive only. No names. Not mine, not anyone's. If I saw a hiker, I'd nod and point with a flat hand like a flight deck crewman. The truck started on the second try, which felt like a vote. The sky was a pale tin, and the smell of rain lived somewhere far away. The tires hummed over the gravel in a rhythm that calmed me despite everything. The woods on either side looked ordinary at a glance, but my eyes kept catching on details that didn't want to be details. An alder leaning the wrong way, a boulder wearing a new chip like a fresh scar, a game trail tied into a knot I couldn't untangle even by staring. At the west meadow, I parked and killed the engine. Quiet gathered. A muted wind combed the grass without moving the tops. It was like watching breath fog on glass that wasn't there. The big spruce at the far edge still stood like a lighthouse in a dark harbor. I scanned for the triangles or small piles of cedar dust. No gifts waited for me, only the meadow's hush and a faint coolness in the air, as if the ground held a pocket of last winter and didn't want to share. I walked the perimeter and kept my boots in my own old steps where I could. I kept my eyes level. I didn't look over my shoulder. When a feeling came, the tap at the back of the neck, the soft suggestion that I was about to be addressed, I swallowed it like a curse and moved on. It faded. The grass whispered something I didn't let become syllables. At the red fur, the marks looked higher. They might have always been that high. Or maybe I hadn't let my head tilt far enough back yesterday to measure. The groupings built up the trunk in those patient fives, then vanished into the green dusk of limbs. At the base, the skirt of bark dust was gone. The wind hadn't taken it. It had been collected. The ground was clean in a new way, like a countertop wiped and dried before a careful job begins. I put my palm flat against the bark. It was cool and a little damp. I held it there and timed 3 breaths. The tree didn't speak. That should have helped. It didn't. The quiet at the center of the grove had thickened into a texture, like the nap of velvet rubbed the wrong way. I want to keep moving. The loop had taken on a rule of its own. If I kept moving, I could pretend the map still matched. The junction came sooner than my feet remembered and later than my head allowed. The post stood where it stood yesterday. The duplicate sign was still mounted, its letters tidy, its instruction neat. The paint had dried to a dull. The wood gave off that scent I was starting to think of as an almost voice, paper and damp, cellar air breathed from a crack. I unscrewed the top bolts slowly. I had the bottom bolt half out when footsteps entered the trail behind me. I didn't spin. I didn't call out. I turned with the practiced steadiness I use when a bear wanders into a campsite, and everyone has to believe they're safe so they don't become something else. It was Saul. He looked like a person you remind yourself, you know. Jacket, radio on his shoulder, hair damp from a hat that wasn't on his head. His eyes were wide in a way I'd never seen on him. The pupils ate the color. "You're early," I said. The words came out flat and human. "You on ridge check?" He shook his head a fraction, like he was testing whether it was attached. "I'm here," he said. "Just here." His gaze drifted past me to the sign and then back to my face, as if he had to remind himself where faces belonged. We stood like that while the woods waited. "You hear anything last night?" I asked finally, keeping my tone like gravel. He licked his lips. His tongue looked pale, like a page pressed too long under glass. "Only wind," he said. He cleared his throat. "And some radio spill." He gestured vaguely at the shoulder mic without touching it. "It's been echoing." I nodded like this was ordinary. "Help me pull this," I said. "We'll bring it in." We worked in a small choreography I did not teach him. The bolts came out. The sign settled into our hands with a little give, like something letting go of something else. When we set it down, the wood left a darker patch on the dirt, a damp rectangle that drank sun. It would evaporate. It would dry. The nose of my head said otherwise. We carried it between us along the trail. The weight was wrong. It didn't fight us. It insisted on guiding us. The path underfoot felt subtly inclined to the left, even on the flats, as if a bowl had been set under one edge of the world and water was obeying. I kept my eyes on the middle distance. The urge to glance between the trees, to check the gaps, to confirm nothing stood in the exact shape of a man, ticked in the spine. I let it tick. "You ever get called?" Saul said casually, and his voice was too casual, from the wrong direction. I kept my breath even. "Yep." He nodded once. The sign flexed a hair in our grip. "Did you?" He let the question hang the way you let a bridge sag to see if it still holds. "No," I said. He breathed out through his nose. For a second, he was just a guy carrying a board in the woods with his coworker. Then the path canted again, and we were not just guys. At a split in the brush where the trail narrows between 2 firs, the light changed without a cloud to blame. The green went darker. The air cooled 1 notch, and the smell of paper rose and settled around us like a dry mist. A voice came from ahead and a little to the right. It used my family name first, the way the chief had the day I got the job, and then it said my first name with a different angle than the one I keep in my own mouth. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The shape of it arrived perfectly formed in my head, as if spoken right into the spot where attention lives. The sign's weight shifted toward the sound. We kept walking. The voice didn't repeat. It didn't have to. The syllables sat there in the understory like something placed carefully on a shelf. I felt Saul's grip tighten and then loosen deliberately. Our boots sorted out rocks they'd always known. The air warmed again at the next bend. The smell thinned into pine and the iron tang of sap. At the truck, I slid the sign into the bed, face down. The damp rectangle on the dirt under it looked darker than dirt should look. I pinned it with ratchet straps, as if it might try to stand back up and return to where it belonged. The straps creaked. It would give one soft sound like a book closing in the next room. Saul didn't climb into his own rig. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched nothing with the focus you dedicate to a loaded thing. It said my name last night, he said finally, and the words that came out with splinters. I didn't tell him he'd be okay. I didn't tell him anything that would turn into a dare standing in my mouth. I nodded to the passenger seat. He didn't move. After a long minute, he nodded back and went to his truck. On the drive down, the radio carried routine like it was a lifeline. The district line asked for a road condition. Kira checked in from the south switchbacks. She found a picnic table turned 90 degrees from the way we'd set it last season, its legs sunk into the dirt without a scrape. A retired couple in Site 19 wanted firewood and not news. I answered only what needed a number. Back at the station, I slid the sign off the tailgate with a grunt and a care I usually reserve for old maps or baby animals. I laid it next to the first one. They were identical like twins who'd practiced. The same small sap, not at the edge of the RN rim. The same shallow waviness in the second stroke of the 2 in 2.3 miles. The same paint fleck, invisible unless the light hit sideways. I took a picture. My phone did the stupid shutter sound. The picture looked fine until I zoomed past the point a person uses. The pixels at the edges of the letters didn't stair-step into noise. They feathered like fibers under a blade. It felt like looking at a tooth too close. I printed the incident report and stacked it on the clipboard and stared at the blank line labeled narrative. There are days when words are the only tool I have. Those days are easier. This was not one of them. I wrote what I could without adding fuel. Removed unauthorized duplicate sign from Junction 3. No vandalism observed. No subjects encountered. I signed my name with a hand that belonged to me. Around noon, a young couple came in, dusty and flushed and embarrassed to be worried. They couldn't find the rim. They had a map. They had done loops here for years. It kept feeling farther, the woman said, frowning at her palms as if the blisters might contain an answer. Like it didn't want to be where it always is. I walked them to the big relief map on the wall and traced the line with my finger like a teacher. I kept my voice even. When they left, the doorbell chime made a little double sound, like an echo from a smaller room nested inside the room we stood in. At 3, the weather lost its patience and came in a hurry. The long bruise of cloud rolled over the ridge, and the day went gray like a film shot indoors. I checked the campground and found fire pits wet cold and kids in bright jackets trying to make rain laugh. A woman in a yellow poncho asked me if the trails drained fast. I told her the truth and pointed her to the boardwalk loop. She thanked me and mispronounced my name by one letter. It shouldn't have landed like a thrown pebble. It did. The radio popped and carried a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years. She'd retired and moved to the desert. She used my call sign perfectly, then asked if I'd copy a plate number for a suspicious vehicle by the overlook. I pressed transmit and asked for her location without using her name. Static chewed her next word, then spit out a number and a sound like a lid sliding over a tin. I wrote the plate down anyway. There are pranks. There are failures. There are also echoes with good aim. By evening, the rain settled in and grew polite. Water braided down the window, and the world outside wore a gauze that made the distance guessable and wrong at once. I closed out the day log and left a note for the morning. 2 signs secured. See me. I turned the radio volume low enough that I'd have to decide to hear it. I locked the station. I stood for a moment under the eaves with the rain stitching the edge of the roof and the lot reflecting a tired sky. The smell of paper wasn't there. The smell of wet dirt and sap was. For a fragile few seconds, I let myself think the woods had taken a step back. That night, I slept in the station on the break room cot, my boots on the floor within reach and my jacket rolled over my head. The hum of the soda machine filled the room with a gentle insistence. The storm spoke to the windows and then lost interest. Somewhere around 2, the building settled. The sound isn't unusual. Wood remembers the load it carries and reminds you. This time it carried a second sound underneath. A light, regular clack. Not loud, not close. A careful, measured touch, as if tiny wedges were being tapped into place along a seam. I lay on my back and stared at the dotted foam tiles and counted. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. Then 5, and a pause longer than the others, like a comma in a sentence that had learned where commas belong. My mouth went dry. I could have stood and turned on the light and broken the pattern. I could have said a name just to have something solid in the room with me. Instead, I pulled the jacket over my face like a kid and let breath steam the inside of the cloth. The smell of polyester was blessedly chemical. The tapping stopped. Silence built up like a wall. From outside, faint as if carried from a hallway the size of the forest, a voice tried a word and found most of it. It wasn't mine at first. It was no one's. Then it curved, slowly, toward me, like it had remembered the way the letters should sit together. It reached the second syllable and put the consonant down wrong. It waited as if listening. It tried again, closer. The soda machine hummed like a transformer in winter. I closed my eyes and thought about the boy with the triangles and the way his mother had watched my face to make sure I wasn't about to tell her a story that would keep her up for a year. I thought about Saul standing like a scarecrow that had learned a posture. I thought about the old chief's hand on my shoulder at the end of my first season, heavy and warm, and the way he'd looked past me at the line of the ridge, like he was leaving responsibility out there for me to find when I was older. The voice tried the third time and almost arrived. It would keep practicing. It would get better. That's how you learn a map or a name or a door. Morning came. It always does if you let it. I filed what I could file. I walked the loop again with Kira and measured distances with my breath instead of the mileposts. We took down a notice that had never been put up and replaced it with a one that had. We tightened bolts that looked already tight. We nodded to visitors who smiled like people who didn't know they were standing in a place that had learned how to rearrange itself with patience. In the days after, the woods did not go back to the way they'd been. They don't owe us that. They simply wore their difference with a calmer face. Some nights the cottonwoods mapped a quiet that felt like a book refusing to open. Some mornings the trails lay where we left them. Some afternoons, voices on the radio used call signs we'd retired and asked for check-ins from ridges that didn't have signal before. I stay because the job is still the job, and because leaving wouldn't be the same thing as safety. I stay because someone has to count cars and check ashes and show a finger's width on a paper map and say, start here, return before dark, listen to the wind, and keep your own name where it belongs. People ask me, sometimes, why I tell this. They ask what good a story like this can do if it doesn't end with an answer you can fold into your pocket. I don't have a speech for that. I only have what kept me alive and what might keep you from stepping at the wrong time into a room that looks like a forest but has shelves. So I'll end with the only useful thing I can give you. The one instruction that belongs to this place and to any other place that decides to practice being something else when night falls and the paper smell rises and the map grows a new crease inside it. Remember it. Keep it. Use it when the dark leans close.